May 5th, 1945. Okinawa. The air is heavy with wet heat and pulverized coral dust, and the ground clings to boots like it wants to keep every man where he falls. Near Urasoemura, a jagged escarpment rises like a broken wall, 400 feet of rock and earth that turns the climb into a slow, exposed descent. Cargo nets tremble under the weight of exhausted bodies. Above the rim, the plateau is not a summit so much as a trap. Smoke, shredded vegetation, and the flat, sudden crack of machine gun fire cutting through the haze. This moment matters because by the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had become a calculus of cliffs and caves, positions built for defense, paid for in blood. Okinawa was the last great stepping stone toward Japan itself, and the fighting around the Maeda Escarpment, nicknamed Hacksaw Ridge by the Americans, was part of that final tightening arc, where every yard taken demanded an answer in casualties, and every casualty demanded time. The ridge was not simply terrain, it was a question asked of human endurance, day after day, under rain, mortar bursts, and the close, unseen threat of Japanese positions dug deep into rock. It was a jagged escarpment, 400 feet high, assaulted under a heavy concentration of artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire, producing approximately 75 casualties in a single surge of violence. The men who climbed those nets carried ordinary expectations of war. Infantrymen expected that survival belonged to firepower, to the man who shot first, to the one who kept his head down and followed the drill. And many expected that a soldier who refused to carry a weapon would become a liability, an extra burden on the line, a moral complication in a battle that allowed no space for hesitation. Desmond Doss entered service as a Seventh-day Adventist pacifist, refusing to bear arms. He endured harassment in training, yet insisted on serving as a medic rather than stepping aside. What Doss expected, what his faith and conscience demanded, was a war fought without taking life, even when surrounded by men who were trained to do exactly that. What his comrades expected was that such conviction would break under pressure or be punished by the battlefield itself. What they experienced was the opposite. On Hacksaw Ridge, the battlefield did not reward ideology. It rewarded action. And on that day, the action came from an unarmed medic who stayed when others could not. As the American troops gained the summit, the Japanese response was immediate and crushing. Artillery, mortars, and machine guns striking the exposed plateau until the position became a scattering of bodies and shattered equipment. When the Americans were driven back, Doss refused to seek cover and remained in the fire-swept area with the many stricken. He began moving the wounded one by one to the edge and lowering them down the cliff on a rope-supported litter to friendly hands. This is where the story becomes cinematic without needing invention, because the facts themselves have rhythm. The plateau, the retreat, the single figure remaining. The repeated motion of rescue as a kind of relentless ritual. The symbolic object that returns again and again is not a weapon. What it is rope. Rope is mundane, used for nets, for loads, for hauling supplies. But on Hacksaw Ridge, rope became a physical argument for American democracy's other kind of power, the power to save. It represents training that values the individual, equipment designed for recovery as well as attack, and an ethic that counts one wounded soldier as worth the risk of one living medic. Doss lowered men using a knot he knew, a practical skill turned into mass survival. Under fire, rope also becomes sound. The rasp against rock, the tightening strain, the quick scrape of fibers as another body is lowered into the smoke below. A repeated, steady friction that cuts through chaos like a metronome. The full span of his actions was not a single instant, but repeated acts between April the 29th and May 21st, 1945, near Urasoemura on Okinawa. On May 2nd, so he exposed himself to heavy rifle and mortar fire to rescue a wounded man 200 yards forward of the lines. 2 days later, he treated 4 men cut down while assaulting a strongly defended cave, advancing through grenades to within 8 yards of enemy forces at the cave mouth, dressing wounds and evacuating them in 4 separate trips under fire. Then comes May 5th, the day the legend condenses into a single number. By nightfall, he had rescued 75 soldiers, lowering them to safety with a rope sling while his unit had been driven back down the escarpment. Through his outstanding bravery and unflinching determination, Doss saved the lives of many soldiers. His name became a symbol throughout the 77th Infantry Division for outstanding gallantry, far above and beyond the call of duty. And this is the emotional contrast that defines Hacksaw Ridge. The Japanese defenders expected Americans to collapse under concentrated fire, to be pinned, to retreat, to leave wounded behind in the killing zone. That expectation had been earned across the Pacific. Defenders used caves, reverse slopes, and interlocking fire with the certainty that evacuation under direct fire would be slow and costly. On that plateau, the defenders could reasonably assume that the moment the Americans broke, the wounded would become silence. The Americans expected casualties, but also expected the mechanics of a withdrawal, covering fire, smoke, and the triage of who could walk and who would have to wait. In those mechanics, there is usually a grim acceptance. Some men remain out of reach until darkness, until a lull, or until another push. And what actually happened was that the lull never came, and the rescues continued anyway. Rope after rope. Lowering after lowering, the act repeated until it became larger than fear, and in that repetition, perception changed. The men who once treated Doss as a contradiction, an unarmed soldier in an army at war, began to see that his refusal to kill did not make him less committed. It made him committed in a different direction, with a purity that the battlefield, paradoxically, could measure. Many of the men who had berated him earlier were among those he saved. Transformation also occurred in how the army itself had to frame courage. Doss's heroism forced the institution to admit that valor was not synonymous with taking life. His actions under fire proved that devotion was far above and beyond the call of duty. Even his later wound sequence reads like selflessness, continuing after his body had reached its limit. On May 21st, during a night attack near Shuri, he stayed in exposed ground, giving aid until he was seriously wounded by grenade fragments. He treated his own injuries and waited 5 hours for litter bearers. When caught in an enemy tank attack, he crawled off the litter so a more critically wounded man could be carried first. Later, he suffered a compound fracture of one arm, bound a rifle stock as a splint, and crawled 300 yards to an aid station. Even here, the symbolic object shifts but does not break. The rifle, an instrument he refused to use for killing, becomes a splint, an improvised tool for survival. The weapon is repurposed into medicine, just as his presence in the unit repurposed doubt into trust. On October 12, 1945, President Harry S. Truman presented Doss the Medal of Honor at the White House. Truman told him, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." It is easy to turn that scene into pure celebration, but the deeper reflection is more complicated and more enduring. Hacksaw Ridge was not a place built for mercy. It was built by terrain and by enemy preparation for maximum suffering. Yet the story that endured from that plateau was not only about bullets and caves. It was about an unarmed medic and a length of rope, about a democracy that could send men to fight and still make room in its highest honor for a man who fought by refusing to kill. Rope, simple, expendable, human in its texture, became the recurring symbol of that truth. And it was the bridge between the rim and the ground below, between the wounded and the living, between the chaos of battle and the stubborn insistence that a single life still mattered. In the end, freedom is often described as a principle. On Hacksaw Ridge, it looked more like a choice repeated 75 times. To go back into the fire-swept area, to tie the line, to lower another body into waiting hands, and to believe that a nation is measured not only by how it conquers, but by how it refuses, under the worst conditions, to abandon its own.